Okay, in addition to those physical effects, chronic stress can also cause some mental, or psychological effects as well. One of them is called learned helplessness. So learned helplessness is this phenomenon where if a person experiences trauma or stress and they feel like they have no control, like they can't do anything about it, then they will often develop this learned helplessness where basically they don't then try, they don't put any effort to help themselves later, even when there's opportunity that they could get help. So this term and this idea came from a study utilizing dogs. The study always makes me super sad to talk about, but basically what they did in this study, they took a group of dogs and they put them in a cage where they were shocked like randomly over the course of an hour or something like that. Half of the dogs had a open door so they could escape from the shock whenever they wanted to. The other half were locked in. There's no way for them to get out. They have to just endure the shock. Then they take all the dogs and they put them in a cage like this, where there's one side that shocks them, one side that does not, and there's just a small barrier that they can easily jump over. The ones who had been locked in the cage and had to endure the shock, whenever they started to get shocked here, they basically just laid down and gave up. They didn't even try to jump over the barrier. But the ones who had the open door, they had an opportunity to escape and help themselves. They very quickly figured out that they could jump over this barrier and go to the other side and not get the shock. Yeah.
So, what if they employed a different stressor for the second phase of this test that wasn't the same thing that they already used?
That's interesting. I'm sure someone's done that study, but I don't know it off the top of my head. That's a very good question. Yeah. I would guess that the further you get from a shock, the less the effect is going to have, right? If instead of a shock you, I don't know, poked them or something physically painful, it might have a similar effect, but then as you get to something that's more psychologically traumatic or whatever, that they might not have that association. But that's entirely, I'm speculating completely.
So I'm them just getting physically accustomed to the shock.
Right.
And a lot of things when it comes when you're shocked, a lot of that discomfort is the surprise of it.
Yeah.
And if you experience that a lot, it's just it's just and so it's maybe they just got used to it and they don't care about getting shocked anymore specifically.
Yeah, that's a very interesting interpretation of it. It's entirely possible. I've never heard that before, so I don't know. But yeah, I bet that study's been done. I would just have to dig around and find it. But yeah, so the original idea by the researchers, so this was in the 1960s, he basically suggested that what's happening is that they learn that they do not have control over their own environment. And so then even when they have an opportunity to escape, they're not looking for that because they feel like this is completely out of my control. I can't do anything about it, so why even try? Is kind of the idea behind learned helplessness. I will say there's all kinds of correlational studies then in humans that kind of extrapolate from this idea. So if you have, for example, a child who has a really traumatic childhood, maybe maybe their parents are abusive, for example, and they can't escape that because they're a kid, they're living with their parents, right? There's nothing they can do about it. Often people in that circumstance will go on to be less successful in all kinds of ways. And this might be a part of it. They might basically internalize all of that and feel like I have no control over my own life or my decisions. So why even try? Why even try, pursuing my dreams or my goals? So there is some correlational evidence in humans that it can generalize and translate in all kinds of, various ways, basically. One of the things I've been reading, so this is kind of a tangent, and I would actually like to get your guys' thoughts on this. I'm in a lot of subreddits and things of professors and teachers, and there's a lot of talk about, how student demographics and things are changing and how student effort is changing, and particularly since the pandemic. A lot of people had classes fully online for 2 years, and maybe the level of that education wasn't great. So then you get students coming to college after that. And I've heard some professors suggest that students might be experiencing this learned helplessness. That if you were in an online class for 2 years of high school, and maybe you're trying to learn, you're trying to do the work, and you maybe try to reach out to your teachers or whatever, but they don't answer very much because they have their own stressors going on, and it's an online class. They don't know how to navigate things, whatever. So you try to get help, but it doesn't work. And then afterwards, you've kind of internalized even if I reach out to my teachers and try to get help, they're not going to help me, so why even bother? So I've heard some professors suggesting that this is like a phenomenon that's currently impacting our education system. So all of you are kind of in that. You're the other side of that conversation. So I'm just curious if any of you, I don't know, have experienced that or feel like there's any legitimacy to that idea or not. Any thoughts? I see some head nodding and some maybe kind ofs. I would actually like to know what your guys' experience of education was during COVID, because I just realized like I haven't, I don't know really. Devin, you can go first.
So everything else through high school has been really easy for me except for math, because I have a math learning disability.
Mm-hmm.
So even that, like you said, a lot of our teachers at our school, they were older and didn't understand how to work the computers very well. They would give us assignments, but they'd be like, okay, go here. Well, the assignment's not there. Okay, well, how do I put it back on the Canvas? That's not our job.
Yeah.
We don't know. You're the teacher. You figure it out. So then a lot of us ended up getting really poor grades because a lot of the assignments weren't posted in the first place.
Yeah. I could see that being frustrating from your side and also from the instructor's side, because a lot of instructors were just like thrown into this. It's like when COVID first started in March of 2020. I don't know if this happened here or like at your institution, but in Iowa where I was teaching, it was basically like we went to spring break and then they sent out an email at the end of spring break and they're like, hey, we're going to put all our classes online for the rest of the semester. So like you have a week to figure it out. And I was lucky because I had done online classes before already. I kind of knew it, but yeah, there were a lot of professors who had never, like didn't even know how to use a computer or an iPhone or anything. And they have to figure out in a week how to put their entire class online. So yeah, Zane had his hand up.
I got my first associates all online.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it kind of depended on the instructor. There's
Yeah.
some instructors I felt like I actually had more contact with them because they were pretty much available. I could Zoom them any time of the day.
Yeah.
And then there were others, I think it was primarily like math teachers. Like when I did calculus, you bought a program that was a third-party program.
Yeah.
That came with a book, that was a third-party book, and they just graded.
Right.
So to me, it kind of seemed like, well, why are they getting my money?
Yeah.
They're the ones that are grading.
Yes. Yeah. Margaret.
So what basically happened is most of my classes, of course, the teachers had problems adjusting. There was difference in communication. But the main part was about my math class. The teacher tried really hard to get adjusted to the internet. And they would always send us sheets, but they would never actually like teach us how to do the sheets.
Right. You just had to basically figure it out yourself using the
there
textbook.
was a certain part of math
Uh-huh.
I had no idea how to do. I would try my best to do it, and I would still send it to the teacher, and somehow I'd get full marks because they didn't really actually do the work.
Yeah.
They understood that with lack of communication,
Right.
the sort of lower level of communication was hard to actually teach.
Yeah.
Sort of subjects.
Yeah, in my experience talking to other professors while it was happening, it seemed like there were kind of two extremes where there were some professors who were like, okay, we're going online, so I'm just going to throw like as much work at you as possible. I'm going to be really rigorous and strict because I want to make sure that like you're getting your education. And then like a lot of people struggle because it's too much, too fast, not a lot of instruction. And then there were other instructors who were like, I'm just going to like give everybody an A basically because like I don't know how to work the system. I don't know, what to do with it. So, but I don't want to like traumatize these students. So like let's just Devin.
You said you have a lot of contact with other teachers and professors. That same math teacher, she says half the class time is spent trying to explain it to one student, but then she gets the same email from 3 other people.
Yeah.
So she has to take like an hour out of her day to answer the same question multiple times.
Yeah.
Instead of just answering it once in the class period.
Yep.
So she said that most of her day was just spent answering the exact same question email wise.
Yeah. Which at that point it's like, well, maybe just copy the email, make a template, and then it only takes 10 minutes to send it instead of an hour, or post an announcement on Canvas for everybody. Or there's ways to make. But if you don't know how to use Canvas or you're not that tech savvy, then it's hard to like find those efficient routes. Alex, I think you've been wanting to say.
So I observed actually something with the professors when they were thrown in at WSU Vancouver, when they were thrown in just out of the blue, had no time to learn how to do this stuff. Some of them were able to adapt, but some of them, I think, just barely found ways to get their classes to work.
Yeah.
And because they had so little time to do it, the systems they developed were really, really janky and not great. And because they learned that in that, you know, stressful time where they had to also be teaching the class, I think that in the next previous semesters, they just kept the bad system that they had developed. And they didn't actually take the time from, like, the various breaks they would have had to establish a better system.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that. Like, I already put all this work into developing it the way it is. Like, I don't care if it doesn't work that effectively. It's easier to just copy and paste and, yeah, do the same thing again, for sure. Yeah.
I went to high school in Portland, and so for my entire junior year, like half the teachers quit. So probably half the classes I had, maybe a couple more than half, they were just subs. They weren't actual teachers. So like they were just people like copying and pasting stuff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And that's like a national problem. There's, I mean, like teacher shortages all over the entire country. And it makes a lot of sense to me because they get paid like $30,000 a year, and some like basically poverty line wages after getting, you know, a degree and a certificate and going through all this training. And yeah, so I can see why a lot of them would have quit, especially when like now take all this stuff and put it online, even though you have no training and don't know how to do it. So, and then yeah, that leaves all these students just like with no teachers or subs, or yeah, it's challenging. So then it's like, you know, so then you get here, right? Which I will say all of you are like fantastic and amazing. So I don't want this to like, I don't want you guys to internalize this in any way at all as like you guys are bad or anything, because you're not. You've been amazing. But yeah, but there are a lot of cases where like there are students who are not so amazing. And it's maybe not their fault because they've been through this education system that was not effective. But then, you know, you have professors who are supposed to take these students and teach them something. And it can be very difficult if they don't have like the foundational skills that they need. So it's like everybody on all sides has a lot of difficulty. Yeah, promise.
I did all of high school online, graduated online, and I now regret that because I have no idea how to do math for like any basic things.
Yeah.
It got to a point where nobody's teaching you, so you're trying to teach yourself, which is not happening. So you just figure out how to pass the class just to get the grade.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm in like basic pre-college math to figure out how to do any of this.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It feels like it gives you some setbacks, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I had that same struggle where I had to drop some of my more rigorous math or like classes. Like if I was taking AP or college classes, I had to drop them because learning online was so hard, and especially with like ADD, staying at your computer home.
Yeah.
With the accountability of not playing video games instead of listening to your like lecture and stuff like that, it was almost impossible to actually learn.
Yeah. Yeah, I could definitely see that. It's, yeah, I mean, as a professor, it's hard to engage with it on the other side online as well. It's like, yeah, I don't know how many times I was teaching online, and it's like, I'm literally just talking to a PowerPoint. Like I would ask students to turn on their cameras or whatever, but nobody would, and I'm not going to force anybody to do it. I don't know what your life is or what's going on behind that camera. Like, that's fine if you want to leave it off. But so then I'm like just literally talking to a PowerPoint for hours a day. So yeah, it's very difficult on both sides, and I'm having this kind of thing where I'm like trying to figure out like, well, how do we go forward? Like, how do we now teach effectively in a college setting where we've had students go through this, and we've had instructors who are quitting and they're experiencing burnout, which we'll talk about, I think, on the next slide. We can go to burnout because we're already basically talking about it. Yeah.
There is something, it's not related to COVID, but learned helplessness that I kind of observed or kind of just made a connection to, and I wanted to get your opinion on. So I've had some friends who have been traumatized basically from bad parents in the sense that, they were, the parents were, addicted to meth and just basically weren't there. And then I've had some friends who have had over-controlling parents that, still provided a family, but there was a lot of weird other stuff going on.
Yeah.
And if you have basically, the no parent, they learn how to take care of themselves.
Yeah.
And you don't have the opposite effect of the learned helplessness. You actually get kind of the very, very assertive and capable mentality.
Right.
But these other people who had relatively better childhoods or less trauma, you know, their entire childhood was based off of, okay, how can I appease this, you know, this
Yeah.
family figure, and they end up in a worse state almost.
Yeah. I mean, anecdotally, I've seen that in my life as well. I mean, I had parents who were pretty neglectful, I would say, like just kind of not there. And I feel like I turned out mostly okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
My best friend in high school had parents who were like complete opposite, helicopter parents, super strict, like were like hovering over him constantly. And he's like a homeless meth addict in Denver now. And like, because then there's also the dynamic of if you have parents who are super strict, who like don't let you leave the house or do anything, then when you turn 18 and you graduate and you move off and you go out by yourself, you don't have that anymore, like controlling you or telling you what to do, then like you don't have that independence or that autonomy. And yeah, I mean, in general, obviously there's all kinds of exceptions to that, but yeah. So, I mean, yeah, there's all different kinds of trauma, and the different kinds of trauma can manifest in all kinds of different interesting ways, for sure. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about burnout, because I think that's, you know, related to what we're talking about. So burnout is basically, you know, this effect that results from chronic repeated stress, usually in a work or school setting. And it typically leads to feelings of basically just like disengagement. You don't want to engage or interact with the setting anymore. You don't want to do your schoolwork. You don't want to go to your job. It often can also lead to feelings of what's called disassociation. So disassociation is where you have kind of almost like an out of body, like you feel a little bit like you're like a robot or an automaton, just kind of like going through life automatically, and maybe kind of like almost like you're watching yourself from a third person perspective a little bit. Yeah, it can also result in things like exhaustion. So you may just feel like, I don't even want to get out of bed. I don't want to do anything. Reduce self-efficacy. So you may start to feel like, you know, everything I do is worthless. What's the point of all of this? And then all of that can reduce performance, you know, either in a school setting or a work setting. So I think, you know, a lot of us probably started to experience this during the pandemic, and, you know, again, doesn't necessarily even have to do with COVID, but other things that are going on as well. So, you know, all of you may have experienced some of these symptoms with your classes, especially online classes and things like that, if you felt like you're not getting anything from it. Especially because, you know, some of these causes that I have listed here, it sounds like you experience that in a lot of your classes. So one of the causes is having unrealistic expectations. So as a student, you know, in a work or in a school setting, those unrealistic expectations might be like, you know, way too many assignments, or assignments at levels that are way higher than what you're ready for. You know, having deadlines that are not, you know, flexible or forgiving. Micromanagement, where basically someone is like trying to manage every single little aspect of what you're doing. Poor instructions, it sounds like a lot of you got that in your online classes. Isolation, that's another thing during the pandemic, right? We don't have that like social interaction in our classes. We can't talk to our friends at lunch every day if your classes are online. And then lack of support and unfair treatment as well can also lead to burnout. So again, I think, you know, it's pretty obvious from what you guys described that from a student's perspective, all of you probably experienced that. I will also say from the professor's experience, a lot of us experienced that as well, kind of on this side, that there were unrealistic expectations. Hey, take this class, put it online in a week, even though you know nothing about computers. There was a lot of micromanagement as well in the way that like the courses were designed. That was kind of an interesting thing that happened, again, back in Iowa, not here yet. I haven't experienced that, at least. I've only been here a quarter, so we'll see. But there was a lot of micromanagement of like your classes need to look a very specific way online, and you know, you need to have your syllabus this way, and it needs to be here, and it needs to look exactly like this, rather than giving us like the autonomy to make it ourselves. So I think both sides experienced a lot of this that led to burnout, again, on both sides, which is causing all kinds of issues. I wish there was something like, I don't know, nice I could say at the end of that to like tie it all up and make it sound good, but I don't know. We're kind of in a weird spot. So I would say everybody just be forgiving of everybody, right? If you have professors that seem like jerks, that like don't care about your circumstances or whatever, maybe just step back and think like, what are they going through? What kind of stresses are they feeling, you know? And I at least try to do the same for all of you guys. I hope all the other instructors here do the same and are forgiving and graceful. I think that's pretty much all we can do right now. So until we find some new norm and figure it out. If you guys have any ideas, of how to like move forward and make better college systems and education systems, feel free to email me or come talk to me, and I'll try to find some way to implement them as much as I can. Okay. Any other comments about any of that before we move on? Okay, so we talked about what causes stress, all these negative impacts it can have. So what are some ways we can cope with stress and maybe try to reduce these negative effects? One of them goes back to that appraisal process. So I said this at the very beginning, but basically the way that you appraise an event is going to determine how stressful that event is and then how impactful that can be in a negative way or not. So during the primary appraisal phase, like I said, if you can tend to think of things as challenges rather than threats, then that often will lead to a much better outcome. That will reduce the stress response and also reduce all of the negative impacts that you have from that. So again, if you have like a test or something coming up, instead of seeing this as like, oh my gosh, this is terrible, I'm gonna fail, and I'm gonna fail this class, blah, blah, blah. If you can see it as a challenge of like, okay, this is an opportunity for me to demonstrate that I know this, it's an opportunity for me to study and grow, then that will often reduce stress. The other thing that's very helpful is also just appraising the stress response itself as a positive thing. Whenever we're stressed, think about all those physiological symptoms I talked about. Our heart rate goes up, we sweat, our pupils dilate, etc. But we also have that exact same physical response whenever we're excited about something. So if, you have some event that you're looking forward to, you're excited about it, you're all going to have a lot of those same physical responses. So if you can actually kind of trick yourself whenever you're feeling stressed out, if you can trick yourself into thinking like, oh, my heart's not beating because I'm stressed, my heart is beating because I'm excited, because I'm looking forward to this event, then that can actually impact the physical response that your body has. I have a video I was going to play, but I think for time's sake, I'll just kind of summarize it. But basically, in the video, they talk about a study where they had participants do this like stress test. And the stress test involves, there's like multiple steps to it. The first step is you get like 5 minutes to put together a presentation on some topic and present it in front of a bunch of people. And then the second step is you have to do this like really like difficult math test out loud in front of people. Like it's just back to back, all these really stressful things that you have to do. And they trained some of those participants to view the stress response as like a positive, healthy thing. So they train them to, if you start to feel your heart beating, think of that as like your body's giving you energy, it's pumping you up to be better at this. The other half, they didn't give them that training. And then they actually looked at like the physical response that the body had to that stressful event. And they found that both groups had their heart rate went up, their sweating went up, but the group that got those positive instructions, their blood vessels like didn't constrict as much as the ones who didn't get the positive instructions. And they make this connection where like that constricting of the blood vessels, that's basically what increases blood pressure, that's what causes hypertension, can eventually lead to heart disease, all those negative physical outcomes. So the group who got the positive like feedback training, they aren't having that negative cardiovascular response. So over time, just that simple act of like tricking yourself into thinking like, okay, this isn't a big deal, this heart rate going up is a good thing, that actually can reduce the chances of like heart disease and all of those negative health responses that we talked about. So just appraising the stress response itself can actually change the negative impacts. In addition to that, social support has been shown to be one of the most effective ways to cope with stress. So having a network of people that you can reach out to get help. Again, there's really obvious ways that helps, right? Like if my car breaks down and I have friends and family members who can help me, they can come give me a ride. They can maybe let me borrow some money to get my car fixed or whatever. That's going to be helpful compared to if I'm completely alone, I have no social support, I can't get help, then I have no way to like deal with my car breaking down. So there's really obvious ways like that. Again, there was a video, second half of the same video. I'll maybe post it on Canvas so you guys can watch it if you want to see the whole thing when you have time by yourself. But another aspect that social support does is it releases a hormone called oxytocin. Have any of you ever heard of oxytocin? It's kind of like one of the more famous neurotransmitters or whatever, sort of like dopamine. So oxytocin, it's both a neurotransmitter and a hormone, and it's released usually when we have physical contact with another person. It's sometimes called like the cuddle hormone or the love hormone because it's, particularly like pronounced if you're like hugging someone that you love. And what's interesting though is that they have found that oxytocin, first of all, it's also part of our stress response. So whenever we get stressed out and we release cortisol and adrenaline, we also release oxytocin. And the oxytocin actually is protective of the cardiovascular system. So it will bind with receptors in the heart and basically like help the heart essentially regenerate cells that are damaged. So the oxytocin actually helps your heart heal. And the interesting thing is that the more you like socially interact with someone, the more oxytocin is released. So social support helps in all those ways I talked about, but it also helps by this very physical mechanism where it causes your body to release a hormone that actually like physically helps your heart recover from stress. So appraisal and social support are big ones. And then I have kind of 3 others that are more minor. One is basically using different coping strategies depending on the particular problem. So there's 2 main coping mechanisms. One is called emotion focused and one is called problem focused. Emotion focused is where you basically are focusing on kind of like reducing your emotional response to the event. So it's kind of like working in your own mind, kind of like appraisal that I'm talking about basically. Problem-focused coping is more where you're trying to think of like a solution to the problem. And both of these can play a very effective role depending on the exact like type of stressor. So it's been shown if there's a stressor that you do have control over, then using the problem-focused coping is better. So like studying for an exam, that's something you have control over. You can think of it as like, okay, I have this exam coming up. The best way to deal with that is for me to study or to go to class or go to office hours or whatever. So when you have control, problem-focused coping is really helpful. When it's something that's out of your control, so like COVID, right? We can't control the fact that there was a pandemic. We can't control what other people do, but it's really stressful. Then emotion-focused coping can actually be better in that case, where you essentially try to like reduce your negative emotions in response to that event. So try to find a silver lining, try to, appraise it in a different way, basically. Some other coping mechanisms that are really helpful, things like exercise, meditation, and what's called biofeedback. So exercise in general, especially like cardiovascular exercise, tends to help in the moment with the stress. It helps distract us. And then obviously it also helps our hearts and, our whole body be healthier so that we have less of those negative impacts. Meditation works in a very similar way. Biofeedback is basically where you have some kind of device like giving you feedback about something that's happening in your body. So that could be like a heart rate monitor. It could be something that's monitoring your brain waves. Anything that's basically telling you what's going on in your body would be considered biofeedback. So it's been shown if you combine biofeedback with like meditation, so if you try meditation and you have something that's telling you like, okay, when you breathe this way, your heart rate is going down. So then you can kind of better like control the meditation experience and kind of optimize it basically. And then the last 2 I'll mention are hardiness and sense of humor. So these are personality characteristics that have been shown to reduce the negative impacts of stress. Hardiness is kind of like conscientiousness, really. It's like this kind of propensity to work hard, to have high autonomy, to want to take control of the situation. And then also having a sense of humor, being able to just like laugh at stressful things that happen, that also reduces stress as well. Okay, I know I rattled through all those pretty quickly, but those are kind of the main coping mechanisms that have been shown to be helpful in reducing stress and also reducing the negative impacts of stress. Any questions about those? All right, last slide, and I'll just say this kind of quickly because we'll talk about this more next week a little bit. So there's a whole area of psychology that's fairly new that focuses mostly on trying to help build, psychological strength and well-being. This really, I would say, positive psychology just started kind of in like the 1990s. It's one of the newest sort of subfields within psychology, although it kind of came out of like humanistic psychology, which we've talked about before, that started earlier. But, you know, it kind of contrasts to a lot of the other fields of psychology tend to focus more on like abnormal negative behaviors and like correcting those, right? Like diagnosing mental illnesses, things like that. Whereas positive psychology is more like, let's build up the positive aspects of a person instead of focusing on anything negative about them, basically. And so there's a lot of researchers within the field of positive psychology that look at like stress and health and how we can use healthy coping mechanisms. That's where a lot of that research comes from. Some of the areas of research that they focus on are things like empathy and altruism. So like what circumstances are people likely to help those around them, even if they're not going to get any kind of like credit or reward for it. Forgiveness and compassion, creativity and resilience. And then the last one I have listed there, you may or may not have heard this term flow. Flow is basically like a state of like optimal performance, basically. You might have experienced it if you play like a sport, for example, and you kind of get to a point where you're like in the zone, is what some people call it, right? Where you're in that state of just like, you know, doing really well. That's called flow. So I'm not going to say much else about positive psych. We'll talk about it next Thursday. Yeah, next Thursday when we do our activity. It'll be based on positive psych. So we'll maybe talk more about it then. Okay.